Welcome back, dear listener. I hope this evening finds you comfortably tucked in, ready to unwind and let your mind drift into the captivating world of ancient history. Before we begin our tale, I'd love to know where in the world you're joining us from tonight. Perhaps you're nestled in a cozy flat in London, just as the city's hustle and bustle begins to quiet down. Or maybe you're savouring a lazy Sunday morning, sipping coffee at a sunlit kitchen table in Sydney. Wherever you may be, I'm honoured to be a part of your day. If you enjoy these relaxing journeys through the annals of history, be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Tonight, we embark on a fascinating exploration of some of history's most notorious and enigmatic figures, the emperors of ancient Rome. At the height of its power, the Roman Empire stretched from the misty moors of Britain to the sun-baked sands of Egypt, encompassing a dazzling mosaic of cultures, languages, and peoples. At the center of it all stood the eternal city itself, Rome, a metropolis of marble, might, and magnificence. Here, at the pulsing heart of the empire, larger-than-life personalities fought, schemed, and struggled for ultimate power. The emperors who ruled Rome were no ordinary men. They were demigods, wielding absolute authority over millions of subjects. But behind the imperial facade, these were flesh and blood human beings, as flawed and fallible as any of us. Some were brilliant statesmen who expanded the bounds of empire. Others were mad tyrants, drunk on power and debauchery. But whether revered or reviled, the names of Rome's emperors have echoed through history, captivating the imaginations of generations. As we delve into the scandalous lives of the Caesars, we'll encounter tales of astonishing excess, devastating betrayals, and chilling brutality. But we'll also uncover surprising moments of tenderness, humor, and even redemption. The real stories behind these legendary rulers are often stranger than fiction, full of unexpected twists and turns that rival the most dramatic Hollywood epics. So make yourself comfortable, dear friend, and let me spin for you the remarkable saga of Rome's emperors. Close your eyes and let my words paint a vivid picture in your mind's eye, transporting you back to a time when the eternal city glittered at the center of the known world. Hear the clatter of chariot wheels on cobbled streets. Breathe in the spiced air of the markets. Feel the marble monuments beneath your fingertips. Our story begins with the very first emperor, Augustus, who rose from the ashes of civil war to usher in a golden age of peace and prosperity. Born Gaius Octavius, he was the great-nephew and adopted son of Julius Caesar. When Caesar was brutally assassinated, the 18-year-old Octavius found himself thrust into the cutthroat world of Roman politics. But the young man proved to be a master strategist, outmaneuvering his rivals to become the sole ruler of the Roman world. He was a man of many faces, a brilliant administrator who stabilized the empire's finances, a cunning politician who brokered alliances and neutralized enemies, and a generous patron of the arts who transformed Rome with grand public works. Augustus was careful to cloak his power in the trappings of republican tradition, never openly declaring himself a monarch. Instead, he styled himself first citizen, piously claiming to have restored the ancient liberties of Rome. But there was no disguising the fact that he held absolute authority, governing with a light yet firm hand. Under Augustus, the empire flourished, ushering in the famous Pax Romana, the Roman peace. It was an era of prosperity and cultural blossoming, as poets like Virgil and Horace sang the praises of the imperial regime. Everywhere one looked, monuments to Augustus's glory rose from the earth, temples, arches, aqueducts, proclaiming his godlike status. But even as he basked in the glow of success, shadows gathered at the edges of Augustus's golden reign. His personal life was marred by heartbreak and scandal, from the untimely deaths of his beloved heirs to the alleged adultery of his daughter Julia. And for all his talk of republican virtue, Augustus had forever transformed Rome, concentrating power in the hands of a single fallible man. As Augustus entered his twilight years, the question of succession loomed over the empire. With his chosen heirs dead and gone, the aging emperor was forced to turn to his stepson Tiberius, a dour and withdrawn man who inspired little affection in his subjects. When Augustus finally breathed his last in 14 AD, it was Tiberius who took up the imperial mantle, the first in a long line of emperors who would shape the destiny of Rome. But Tiberius, as we shall see, was a far cry from the genial and accomplished Augustus. Brooding and paranoid, he retreated from the spotlight, ruling from the shadows of his villa on the island of Capri. Under his reign, a pall of suspicion and recrimination fell over Rome, as the emperor's feared enforcers rooted out any hint of disloyalty or dissent. As our story unfolds, we'll meet a colourful cast of characters who followed in Tiberius's footsteps: the mad and depraved Caligula, the wise and scholarly Claudius, the artistic yet tyrannical Nero. Each emperor left his mark on the empire, for good or ill, shaping the course of history with his ambitions, fears, and follies. But through it all, the spirit of Rome endured, a testament to the resilience and ingenuity of the Roman people. Even in the darkest days of imperial misrule, the empire remained a beacon of civilization, a shining light in a world of chaos and barbarism. So let us journey back in time now, you and I, to walk the streets of ancient Rome and witness the triumphs and tragedies of its most famous sons. Rest your head, dear listener, and let the eternal city work its magic on your dreams. Tomorrow, our adventure continues. The Roman Empire was a realm of paradoxes, a civilization of profound achievements in engineering, art, and law, yet also a stage for some of history's most notorious tyrants. From the heights of power, the emperors of Rome indulged in debaucheries, unleashed horrific violence, and engaged in sordid betrayals that still shock us centuries later. But to understand the twisted intrigues of the imperial court, we must first picture the empire over which these men reigned supreme. At its height, the Roman Empire stretched from the mist-shrouded hills of Britain to the baking sands of Arabia, from the foaming Atlantic to the shimmering Euphrates. All roads led to Rome, the eternal city, where the emperor sat enthroned in unrivaled power and splendor. An emperor's word was law, his whims were policy, and his desires were the obsession of millions. In the imperial palace, high on the Palatine Hill, amid marbled halls and colonnaded courtyards, the great game of politics played out in whispered conspiracies and sudden coups, as men schemed and murdered for the ultimate prize. But let us begin our tale with the first and greatest of the emperors, Augustus, the adopted son and heir of Julius Caesar. Born Gaius Octavius, this sickly youth seemed an unlikely candidate for greatness. But through cunning, ruthlessness, and sheer force of will, he clawed his way to the top of the bloody heap that was Roman politics in the late Republic. After his victory over Mark Antony and Cleopatra, Octavian stood alone, master of the Roman world. Humbly proclaiming the restoration of the Republic, he held the reins of power as first citizen, or princeps. The age of the emperors had begun. Under Augustus, Rome reached the pinnacle of its power and prosperity. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, reigned from the Rhine to the Nile. Great public works transformed the capital: baths, aqueducts, theatres, temples. As Augustus himself boasted, "I found Rome a city of bricks and left it a city of marble." But the question of succession haunted Augustus in his later years. Having no son of his own, he turned to his stepson Tiberius, a dour and uncharismatic man who had proven himself on the battlefield. When Augustus breathed his last in 14 AD, Tiberius took up the imperial purple and settled onto the throne for a long and unhappy reign. Where Augustus had been genial and conciliatory, Tiberius was gloomy and mistrustful. Leaving Rome for the Isle of Capri, he descended into a fog of paranoia and perversion. Treason trials multiplied as informers preyed on the wealthy, and the old emperor amused himself with scandalous depravities in his pleasure gardens. Tiberius did, however, make one decision with momentous consequences. He named as his heir a young man named Gaius, better known to history as Caligula. The son of a beloved general, Caligula had been a pampered child mascot of the legions, toddling about the battlefields in miniature armor with tiny caligae, or military boots, that gave him his nickname. When Tiberius finally expired, smothered some say, with a pillow at Caligula's order, the 25-year-old bounded onto the stage as a bright young hope for the empire. He released political prisoners, put on splendid games and gladiatorial shows, and charmed the public with his youthful energy. But Caligula's early promise gave way to a reign of madness and monstrosity. Illness and power seemed to have unhinged his mind. The boyish grin twisted into a rictus of insane cruelty. He reveled in bloodshed, torture, and sexual excess. If the rumors are true, he made his horse a priest, ordered the army to collect seashells as spoils of war against Neptune, and tried to appoint the horse as consul. After 4 years of escalating lunacy, Caligula was cut down by his own guards in a palace coup. Chaos erupted as the Senate debated a return to the Republic, but the Praetorian Guard had other ideas. Searching the palace, they found a middle-aged man quivering behind a curtain. Claudius, the uncle of Caligula, a timid scholar who had played the fool to survive. The Praetorians hauled the bewildered Claudius before the troops and proclaimed him the new emperor. Whatever Claudius's shortcomings, he did not lack courage or determination. Overcoming his stutter and shambling gait, he set about asserting his authority and proving himself an able administrator. Claudius expanded the empire, launching the conquest of Britain and annexing new provinces. He poured money into public works, expanding the harbour at Ostia and constructing new aqueducts for Rome's ever-growing population. But for all his steadiness in governance, Claudius was less astute when it came to choosing wives. His third wife, Valeria Messalina, was a nymphomaniac of epic proportions. Her endless affairs and orgies were the scandal of Rome. Eventually, her excesses went too far when she publicly married one of her lovers in a mock ceremony. Even the cuckolded Claudius could not ignore this shocking insult. He ordered Messalina's execution and shortly thereafter made the most fateful decision of his reign. As his fourth wife, Claudius chose his niece Agrippina the Younger, a conniving beauty with immense ambitions, not for herself, but for her son from a previous marriage, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, the future emperor Nero. From the start, Agrippina schemed to put her boy on the throne. She persuaded Claudius to adopt the lad and make him heir, pushing aside his own son, Britannicus. Then, if ancient accounts are to be believed, she served Claudius a dinner of death, poisoning him with mushrooms so that Nero, a smooth-cheeked youth of 16, could claim the imperial purple. Nero, in his early reign, made a positive impression, guided by capable advisors like the philosopher Seneca. But his true colours soon showed. He had his stepbrother Britannicus poisoned at a banquet and arranged the murder of his own mother Agrippina when her influence grew too troublesome. The young emperor fancied himself a great artist, fancying the stage to the throne room. He ordered statues of himself erected, coins stamped with his likeness, and endless festivals where he could display his dubious talents as musician and charioteer. But Nero's name will forever be linked with one of the greatest disasters in Roman history, the Great Fire that consumed much of the city in 64 AD. As flames devoured the close-packed houses and shops, Nero, it was said, watched the inferno from a tower, singing of the fall of Troy. Rumours flew that Nero himself had started the blaze to clear land for his sprawling Golden House pleasure palace. To deflect blame, Nero found a convenient scapegoat, the small sect of Christians, whose shadowy rites and talk of a coming kingdom made ready fuel for suspicion. Nero launched the first great persecution, torturing Christians and burning them as human torches. As unrest grew, Nero lashed out in paranoia. Former allies like Seneca fell to the executioner. The empire teetered on the brink. Finally, the legions could take no more. Mutinies flared across the provinces. Roman governors rose in revolt. Abandoned by the Praetorian Guard, Nero was declared a public enemy by the Senate. Fleeing to a country villa, he chose to end his life on his own terms, plunging a dagger into his throat with the help of a loyal freedman. His dying words were a lament, "What an artist dies in me." With Nero's fall, the dynasty founded by Augustus was extinguished. The empire plunged into a time of turmoil known as the Year of the Four Emperors, as rival claimants battled for supremacy. First came Galba, a strict general unloved by the soldiers for his discipline and tight-fistedness. Mere months after his accession, he was cut down by the Praetorians in the Forum, hacked apart so brutally that his head was brought to his usurper Otho on a pike. But Otho, once a drinking buddy of Nero, found his claim challenged by Vitellius, commander of the legions in Germania. The two forces met in a great battle at Bedriacum in northern Italy. When the news came that his army was defeated, Otho fell on his sword, determined to spare the empire further bloodshed. Vitellius, however, would prove a poor excuse for an emperor, more interested in gorging himself on banquets than governance. As he dined, a new rival gathered strength in the east. Titus Flavius Vespasianus, a grizzled commander fresh from putting down the Jewish revolt in Judea. Hailed as emperor by the legions of Syria and Egypt, Vespasian sent his forces under the command of Mark Antony Primus, marching into Italy. In a second battle of Bedriacum, Vitellius's army was routed. Vespasian's brother Titus stormed Rome, and Vitellius was dragged from his palace, tortured, and flung into the Tiber. With Vespasian's victory, a new imperial dynasty dawned. The Flavians would rule for 27 years, a time of consolidation and construction, when the Colosseum rose and Pompeii vanished under the ash of Vesuvius. Vespasian proved a steady hand, shoring up the empire's finances and restoring discipline to the army. After a decade of able rule, Vespasian was succeeded by his eldest son Titus, the conqueror of Jerusalem. Titus had once been famed for his extravagance and love affairs, but he rose to the challenge of leadership, overseeing relief efforts after the eruption of Vesuvius with compassion and energy. When he died of a sudden fever after just 2 years in power, he was mourned as a ruler of great promise cut short. The younger son of Vespasian, Domitian, was cut from a very different cloth. A mediocre administrator and military commander, he was possessed by grandiose visions of his own divinity. He insisted on being addressed as master and god and filled the empire with his statues. Brooding and paranoid, Domitian unleashed a reign of terror, torturing and executing senators and officials on thin pretexts. He kept a tablet of traitors to be killed and revelled in cruel entertainments in the arena. After 15 years of despotism, he was stabbed to death in his bedroom by a gang of conspirators led by his chamberlain. With Domitian's assassination in 96 AD, an era ended. The Senate quickly named as emperor a respected elderly statesman named Nerva. This ushered in the golden age of the 5 good emperors, a dynasty not of blood, but of merit. Each emperor would adopt a worthy successor to follow him. It was a time of prosperity, expansion, and relative stability after a century of madness and excess. Under the wise rule of Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, the empire reached its greatest extent from Hadrian's wall in Britain to the edge of Mesopotamia. Law, learning, and commerce flourished. The Stoic philosophy of Marcus Aurelius, the last of the five, reflected the restrained imperial ideal. But the era of reason ended with the accession of Marcus Aurelius's cruel and deranged son, Commodus, in 180 AD. A muscle-bound megalomaniac, Commodus believed himself the reincarnation of Hercules. He fought in the arena as a gladiator and slaughtered exotic beasts before the roaring crowds. After more than a decade of misrule, a palace coup finally brought his bloody reign to an end. The cycle of chaos and civil war began anew, ushering in a time of crisis for the empire. In the turbulent 3rd century, more than 20 emperors would rise and fall, many meeting violent ends after only months in power. Among the most notorious was Elagabalus, a teenage priest of a Syrian sun god. Elagabalus scandalized Rome with his effeminate dress, orgiastic rituals, and outrageous sexual antics. He was eventually murdered by his own guards, his mutilated corpse dragged through the streets. The empire itself seemed on the verge of disintegration, beset by barbarian invasions, plague, economic collapse, and constant usurpations. The Emperor Valerian was even captured in battle by the Persian king Shapur I, an unprecedented humiliation. Order was finally restored by Diocletian, a soldier emperor of great foresight. To stabilize the empire, Diocletian divided power among 4 co-emperors in a system called the Tetrarchy. While successful in the short term, the Tetrarchy eventually crumbled into renewed civil war. From the wreckage emerged Constantine the Great, who would transform the empire as no ruler had since Augustus. In 312 AD, on the eve of a battle against his rival Maxentius, Constantine experienced a vision of a cross in the sky with the words, "In this sign, conquer." Marching under the banner of Christ, Constantine triumphed and soon established Christianity as the imperial religion. He founded a new capital in the east, Constantinople, that would endure as the heart of a Roman Empire for another 1,000 years after the fall of Rome itself. With Constantine, the classical age of the Roman emperors came to a close. The old gods were swept away and a new order dawned. But the stories of madness, decadence, and brutality that marked the reigns of so many emperors continue to fascinate and appall us. The lives of the Caesars serve as a cautionary tale of the corrupting effects of absolute power. They remind us of the fragility of civilization and the capacity for both greatness and depravity that reside within the human heart. In the end, the emperors were simply men, all too mortal, grappling with the burdens of an immortal empire. Soft, calming narration. As the sun set over the shimmering Mediterranean, the great city of Rome shone like a beacon in the gathering darkness. Perched on its 7 hills, the capital of the vast Roman Empire was a wonder to behold. Gleaming marble temples and bustling forums testified to the wealth and sophistication of this cosmopolitan metropolis. All roads led to Rome, it was said, and at the very center of it all, in resplendent palaces atop the Palatine Hill, resided the emperor, the most powerful man in the ancient world. But all was not well in the imperial court, for behind the pomp and grandeur lurked an uglier reality, a sordid realm of ruthless ambition, wanton excess, and cutthroat intrigue. The emperors of Rome lived like gods, their every whim indulged, their power unchecked. Yet it was a precarious existence, for betrayal and violent death were constant companions to these often unstable men who schemed and struggled their way to the top. Perhaps no ruler embodied both the glory and the decadence of imperial Rome more than Nero. The last emperor of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, founded by Augustus, Nero's 14-year reign shocked and titillated the ancient world. Born Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus in 37 AD, Nero was the nephew and adopted son of Emperor Claudius. His mother, Julia Agrippina, was a great-granddaughter of Augustus himself and a woman of towering ambition. She would stop at nothing to place her son on the throne. Through cunning manipulation and outright murder, Agrippina eliminated rivals and persuaded Claudius to make Nero his heir. When Claudius died suddenly, in 54 AD, likely from a dose of poisoned mushrooms served by Agrippina herself, Nero ascended to power at the tender age of 16. But the young emperor soon chafed under his domineering mother's control. Tensions escalated until Nero moved to have Agrippina killed, a heinous act of matricide that foreshadowed the depravity to come. Now, without restraint, Nero dove headlong into a life of sybaritic pleasure and artistic pursuits. He fancied himself a great poet, musician and charioteer, and would force senators and the public to endure his long, self-indulgent performances. Colossal statues were erected in his image, while his golden house, a sprawling palace of unimaginable opulence, sprang up in the heart of Rome. But Nero's delusions of grandeur took a devastating turn in 64 AD, when a massive fire engulfed the city. As flames raged for 9 days, destroying 2/3 of Rome, Nero reportedly watched the inferno from a tower, singing of the fall of Troy in his stage costume. Rumors swirled that the emperor himself had set the blaze to clear land for an expanded palace. To deflect blame, Nero targeted the Christians, then a small sect, initiating the first empire-wide persecution as he had believers thrown to the lions, crucified and burned as human torches. Nero's antics and misrule finally exhausted the patience of the empire. Faced with rebellion by the armies, the Senate declared him a public enemy. As soldiers closed in, the desperate emperor opted for suicide. "What an artist dies in me," he lamented, before forcing his secretary to drive a blade into his neck. The last of the Julio Claudians was dead at 30, leaving a legacy of lurid notoriety that would echo through the ages. Yet Nero's tumultuous reign was merely one chapter in the long, bloody saga of imperial succession. With no clear rules in place, the transfer of power often devolved into a ruthless game of murder and coercion. And so, as the year 69 AD dawned, Rome descended into chaos as rival claimants battled for supremacy. In the span of just 12 months, the empire would see the rise and fall of 4 different emperors. The first was Galba, a senator and governor of Hispania who had revolted against Nero. Hailed as the new Augustus, he rode into Rome expecting a warm welcome. Instead, he faced open hostility from the Praetorian Guard, who resented his refusal to pay the expected donative. Galba's miserly ways and harsh discipline quickly bred discontent. His reign lasted only 7 months before Otho, a one-time friend turned rival, had him cut down in the Roman Forum. But Otho too would enjoy only the briefest taste of power, for at the same time, the legions in Germany had declared for their own commander, Vitellius. As Vitellian forces marched on Rome, Otho's troops were routed in a fierce battle at Bedriacum. Rather than prolong the bloodshed, Otho fell on his sword, having ruled a mere 3 months. Vitellius entered the capital in triumph, only to prove himself a gluttonous and cruel tyrant. He hosted lavish feasts while his soldiers ran amok and the empire drifted into anarchy. The legions of the East, disgusted by reports of his conduct, threw their support behind their battle-tested general Vespasian. As the Flavians advanced into Italy, Vitellius made a half-hearted attempt to abdicate, then hid himself in the palace. On December 20th, 69 AD, he was dragged through the streets, tortured, and flung into the Tiber. So ended the year of the 4 emperors, a turbulent spasm of violence and instability that exposed the deadly fault lines of a system built on military force and personal charisma rather than rule of law. The emergence of Vespasian would usher in a welcome period of competent governance and a new imperial dynasty. But the spectre of volatility and viciousness would forever haunt the halls of power in Rome. As night fell over the palace district, its marble facades bathed in moonlight, all seemed deceptively tranquil. Here at the pulsing heart of the empire, behind the high walls of the Domus Augustana, the emperor slept, alone with his dreams of glory, his fears of treachery. Little could he know which would prove the greater danger in the uncertain days ahead, the enemies without, or the demons within. As we delve further into the tumultuous history of the Roman emperors, we come to a period of particular instability known as the Year of the Four Emperors. In the wake of Nero's shocking demise, the empire was plunged into chaos as a rapid succession of would-be rulers vied for the throne. The first contender to stake his claim was Servius Sulpicius Galba, a grizzled old general and governor of Hispania. Hailed as emperor by his legions, Galba marched on Rome, only to quickly prove himself ill-suited for the role. Miserly and strict to a fault, he swiftly alienated the Praetorian Guard by reneging on promised bonuses. Discontent festered until the Praetorians took matters into their own hands, brutally assassinating Galba in the Roman Forum a mere 7 months after he took power. In Galba's place, the Praetorians elevated Marcus Salvius Otho, a longtime friend and confidant of Nero. But Otho's reign would prove even more fleeting than his predecessors. Far to the north, the legions in Germania had already thrown their support behind their own commander, Aulus Vitellius. As Vitellius marched his forces down the Italian peninsula, Otho rode out to meet him, only to be decisively defeated in battle. Rather than prolong the civil war, Otho fell on his own sword, his brief stint as emperor lasting just 3 months. Vitellius entered Rome triumphantly, hailed as emperor by the Senate. But he would have little time to savor his victory. In the eastern provinces, the seasoned general Titus Flavius Vespasianus had been declared emperor by his own legions. As Vespasian advanced westward, Vitellius found his support crumbling. The Danube legions turned against him, marching on Rome and crushing Vitellius' defenders in a fierce battle right in the city streets. Vitellius himself was captured, tortured, and put to death, his body unceremoniously dumped into the Tiber River. And so Vespasian, the 4th emperor to rule in this turbulent year, at last took firm control of the empire. The Flavian dynasty he founded would bring a much-needed measure of stability after the chaos of the previous months. But, as we shall see, even Vespasian and his sons were not immune to the intrigues and excesses that so often characterize the lives of the Roman emperors. Vespasian proved himself to be an able and efficient ruler, a welcome change from the indulgent debauchery of some of his predecessors. A man of relatively humble origins, he brought a no-nonsense practicality to the administration of the empire. He reformed the tax system, launched major building projects like the Colosseum, and successfully put down revolts in Judea and Gaul. But even the most competent of emperors could not escape the whims of fate and the machinations of those closest to them. In 79 AD, after a decade of steady rule, Vespasian fell ill and died, leaving the empire to his eldest son, Titus. Though his reign was brief, cut short by a sudden fever, Titus had already made his mark as a military commander, culminating in his ruthless conquest of Jerusalem in 70 AD. It was Vespasian's younger son, Domitian, who would prove the most troubling of the Flavian emperors. Ruling for 15 years after the death of Titus, Domitian's reign began promisingly enough, but slowly descended into paranoia and megalomania. He insisted on being addressed as master and god, executed scores of senators for alleged treason, and even had his own cousin put to death on flimsy charges. Domitian's excesses finally caught up with him in 96 AD, when he was assassinated in a palace coup. The once respected Flavian dynasty ended in disgrace, a grim reminder of how quickly power could corrupt even the most promising of rulers. But from the ashes of Domitian's downfall, a new era dawned for the empire. The so-called Five Good Emperors would preside over a period of relative peace, prosperity, and imperial expansion. It began with the brief reign of the elderly Senator Nerva, hastily installed by the conspirators who had removed Domitian. To shore up his shaky position, Nerva made a canny political move, adopting the popular General Trajan as his heir. When Nerva died after just 16 months on the throne, Trajan was ready to assume the purple, ushering in an era of military victories and territorial gains that would see the empire reach its greatest extent. Trajan's conquests in Dacia and Parthia filled Rome's coffers with plundered gold and its squares with triumphal monuments, including the iconic Trajan's Column. But he wasn't just a warrior emperor. Trajan was known for his fairness, his moderation, and his respect for the Senate, qualities that made him immensely popular with the people. When Trajan died in 117 AD, he was peacefully succeeded by his own chosen heir, Hadrian. A very different sort of ruler than the militaristic Trajan, Hadrian was a cultured, well-traveled intellectual with a passion for art, architecture, and Greek philosophy. His reign was marked more by diplomacy and consolidation than conquest, as he pulled back from some of Trajan's more overextended frontiers. Hadrian is perhaps best remembered today for the sprawling villa complex he built for himself at Tivoli and for the mighty wall he constructed across Britain to mark the empire's northern limit. But he was also a complex, often melancholic figure, haunted by the death of his young lover, Antinous, whom he mourned extravagantly and even had deified. The reigns of Hadrian's successors, Antoninus Pius and Marcus Aurelius, were largely a continuation of his policies, a time of relative tranquility that the historian Edward Gibbon would later dub the happiest era in human history. Antoninus ruled peacefully for over 2 decades, avoiding major wars and focusing on sound administration. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, faced greater challenges in the form of invasions, plagues, and family strife, but met them with the stoic resolve espoused in his famous Meditations. Yet even in this golden age of imperial rule, the old spectre of succession reared its head. For in a decision that would have fateful consequences, Marcus Aurelius chose to break with recent tradition and name his own son, Commodus, as his heir. It was a choice that would plunge the empire back into chaos and set the stage for a new era of tumult. Commodus, it soon became clear, was cut from a very different cloth than his wise and restrained father. Vain, impulsive, and with a cruel streak a mile wide, he quickly set about undoing much of Marcus Aurelius's good work. He executed scores of leading senators, often on the flimsiest of pretexts, and confiscated their wealth to fund his extravagant lifestyle. But Commodus's greatest obsession was with the gladiatorial arena. Not content to merely sponsor the games, as other emperors had done, Commodus insisted on fighting in them himself. He would slaughter exotic animals by the dozen and square off against overmatched opponents, basking in the adulation of the plebeian mob. This shameless exhibitionism appalled and alienated the senatorial class. In 192 AD, after over a decade of misrule, Commodus was strangled in his bath by a wrestler named Narcissus, apparently on the orders of his own inner circle. His death marked the end of the Nerva-Antonine dynasty and plunged the empire back into civil strife. In the chaotic scramble for power that followed, an old, respected senator named Pertinax was briefly installed as emperor, only to be slain by the Praetorian Guard after a mere 87 days. What came next was a moment of supreme ignominy for the empire. The Praetorians actually auctioned off the imperial throne to the highest bidder. The winner of this sordid raffle was Didius Julianus, a wealthy senator who enjoyed his bought-and-paid-for rule for a scant 9 weeks before being ousted and executed by the legions of Septimius Severus, a hard-bitten general from North Africa. Severus would go on to found a new dynasty and put his stamp on the empire, but his rise to power was a stark illustration of just how far the Principate had devolved since the days of Augustus. Under Severus and his successors, the empire took on an increasingly militaristic and autocratic character. Severus paid handsome bonuses to curry favour with the legions, a policy that would contribute to later instability as armies fought to install their favoured candidates. He also launched successful wars against the Parthians in the east, expanding Rome's frontier to its furthest extent. But like so many emperors before him, Severus struggled with the problem of succession. His 2 sons, Caracalla and Geta, were bitter rivals, and their feud came to a bloody head after Severus's death in 211 AD. Caracalla had his younger brother murdered in their mother's arms, inaugurating a reign of terror that saw him execute thousands of Geta's real or imagined supporters. Caracalla is perhaps best known for the enormous bath complex he constructed in Rome and for the citizenship edict that extended Roman citizenship to all free men in the empire, a measure likely motivated more by a desire for tax revenue than any sense of egalitarianism. His erratic, tyrannical behaviour made him deeply unpopular, and in 217 AD, he was assassinated by a disgruntled soldier during a campaign in the east. What followed was a dizzying, revolving door of emperors, as generals and praetorian prefects vied for power. The teenage Elagabalus, a Syrian priest of an exotic sun god, shocked Roman sensibilities with his sexual excesses and religious eccentricities before being murdered by his own guards. His cousin and successor, Alexander Severus, was a more respectable figure, but still fell victim to a mutiny after a disastrous campaign against the Germanic tribes. The years of chaos that followed Alexander's death are often referred to as the crisis of the 3rd century, a period when the very survival of the empire seemed in doubt. A bewildering array of would-be emperors rose and fell in quick succession, their reigns often lasting only a few months or even weeks. The empire fractured into warring regional blocs as ambitious generals carved out their own rump states. It was an era that saw some of the most improbable figures don the imperial purple. There was Philip the Arab, who presided over the 1000th anniversary of Rome's founding in 247 AD before being killed in battle against his own successor, Decius. There was Valerian, who had the misfortune to be captured in battle by the Persian Sassanids, spending his final days as a human footstool for their king, before allegedly being stuffed and displayed as a trophy. But out of this brutal winnowing of emperors, a few figures of real substance emerged, men who managed to impose a degree of order on the chaos through a combination of military prowess, administrative acumen, and sheer force of will. Chief among these was Diocletian, a low-born soldier from Dalmatia who seized power in 284 AD after a typically bloody struggle. Diocletian's great innovation was the Tetrarchy, a system of rule in which imperial power was shared between 4 co-emperors, 2 senior Augusti and 2 junior Caesars. The idea was to provide for stable succession and allow the empire to be governed more effectively by dividing responsibilities. And for a time, it worked. Diocletian and his colleague Maximian were able to quell internal revolts, beat back foreign invaders, and institute sweeping economic and administrative reforms. But the Tetrarchy also sowed the seeds of future conflict. When Diocletian and Maximian retired in 305 AD, the first and last emperors to voluntarily abdicate their successors, Constantius and Galerius, quickly fell to squabbling. The system broke down as rival claimants once again plunged the empire into civil war. From this scrum emerged one of the towering figures of Roman history, Constantine the Great. The son of Constantius, Constantine outcame his rivals through a series of brilliant military campaigns, finally defeating the last of them, Licinius, in 324 AD to become sole ruler of the empire. Constantine's reign marked a turning point in Roman history. Most famously, he converted to Christianity and ended centuries of on-and-off persecution, setting the stage for it to become the dominant religion of the empire and of Europe. He refounded the ancient Greek city of Byzantium as Constantinople, the new Rome that would serve as imperial capital for centuries to come. But in other ways, Constantine's rule represented continuity as much as change. Like so many emperors before him, he was a military strongman at heart, one who had clawed his way to the throne through violence and cunning. He could be ruthless in eliminating potential rivals, even having his own wife and son killed under murky circumstances. And like his predecessors, Constantine found the challenge of succession to be a thorny one. Upon his death in 337 AD, the empire was once again divided between his surviving sons, setting the stage for renewed power struggles. The cycle that had played out so many times before, of brief stability followed by conflict and upheaval, looked set to repeat itself. Yet as we reflect on the long and turbulent history of the Roman emperors, it's important to remember that for all their flaws and foibles, for all the debauchery, violence, and betrayal that so often characterized their reigns, these men held together one of the greatest and most enduring empires the world has ever seen. Through external invasions and internal strife, through plagues and famines and civil wars, Rome endured for centuries under their rule. And their stories continue to captivate us to this day, to serve as both cautionary tales and objects of fascination. There is something profoundly human in the rise and fall of the emperors, in their outsized personalities and their often ignominious ends. They remind us of the corrupting nature of absolute power, of the way that even the most promising of leaders can be undone by their own hubris and excesses. But they also speak to the resilience of the human spirit, to the way that even in the darkest of times, there are those who rise to the occasion, who shoulder the immense burden of leadership and strive, however imperfectly, to leave their mark on history. The Roman emperors, for all their flaws, were undeniably men who shaped the course of human events, whose legacies echo down to us through the millennia. And so, as we drift off to sleep, let us ponder these distant, half-mythical figures, these men who bestrode the narrow world like colossuses. Let us marvel at their triumphs and mourn their tragedies, and let us never forget the lessons they can teach us about the perils and possibilities of power. For in the end, the story of the Roman emperors is in many ways the story of humanity itself, in all its grandeur and folly. As the sun set over the 7 hills of Rome, a hush fell over the bustling metropolis that was the beating heart of an empire. In the opulent palaces perched high above the city, the emperors retired to their chambers after another day of wielding absolute power over millions of subjects, stretching from the misty highlands of Britain to the sun-baked sands of Arabia. But for these rulers, who were worshipped as gods on earth, the trappings of unimaginable wealth and authority could never quite ease the ever-present spectre of treachery lurking in the shadows. For to be a Roman emperor was to live each day poised precariously on the edge of a glittering sword. Anointed by the army, ratified by the Senate, an emperor reigned supreme as the master of the known world. Yet his grasp on power remained always tenuous, forever vulnerable to the caprices of fickle legions, scheming courtiers, and even his own flesh and blood. In a monarchy without clear rules of succession, an emperor knew that even his own children might one day prove his deadliest foes in the never-ending scramble for the imperial purple. So it had been for generations, ever since that fateful day over 40 years before the birth of Christ, when the Roman Republic breathed its last, and a baby boy named Octavian first greeted the world. Born into one of Rome's most ancient patrician families, few could have guessed that this sickly child would one day rise to become Augustus, the first and arguably greatest of Rome's emperors. Through a combination of bold military conquests, shrewd political maneuvering, and carefully cultivated propaganda, Augustus masterfully navigated the treacherous currents of Roman politics to emerge as the supreme leader of an empire that he would guide into a golden age of peace and prosperity. But even Augustus was not immune to the brutal realities of dynastic politics. Having no sons of his own, he was forced to scour his extended family for a suitable heir. After the premature deaths of his nephews Lucius and Gaius, he finally settled on his stepson Tiberius, a gloomy and paranoid man whose 23-year reign would be marred by treason trials and escalating tensions with the Senate. Upon his death in 37 AD, Tiberius would pass the throne to his grandnephew Gaius, better known to history as Caligula. If there was ever an emperor who embodied both the grandeur and madness of imperial Rome, it was surely Caligula. The young emperor's early months were a model of wise and moderate governance, filled with lavish public spectacles and wildly popular reforms. But then something changed. Some say it was a grave illness that unhinged his mind, while others whisper of a potion that slowly poisoned his reason. Whatever the cause, Caligula soon descended into a frenzy of sadism and excess that would make him the most notorious of all Rome's rulers. No perversion was too outrageous, no whim too expensive for Caligula to indulge. He turned his palace into a brothel staffed by the wives of prominent citizens. He deified himself as a living god and ordered a bridge to be built so he could ride across the Bay of Naples. Perhaps most infamously, he even tried to appoint his favourite horse as a priest and consul. After years of escalating insanity, Caligula was finally assassinated by his own guards, a fate that would befall so many who dared to don the imperial purple. In the wake of Caligula's bloody demise, the Praetorian Guard would pluck his uncle Claudius from behind a curtain and proclaim him the new master of the Roman world. A brilliant scholar with a passion for history and law, Claudius proved himself a capable administrator who expanded Roman citizenship and launched the conquest of Britain. But for all his achievements, Claudius could never escape the toxic intrigues that swirled through his own palace. Chief among the schemers was his third wife, Valeria Messalina, a femme fatale whose name would become synonymous with insatiable lust. While Claudius was busy with matters of state, Messalina hosted wild orgies and took countless lovers, even daring to publicly marry her favourite consort in a brazen act of bigamy. When news of the false wedding finally reached Claudius, the betrayed emperor had his wife executed, along with dozens of her suspected paramours. But Messalina would swiftly be replaced by an even more ruthless operator, Claudius's niece, Agrippina the Younger. Beautiful, brilliant, and utterly immoral, Agrippina seduced her uncle into marriage and persuaded him to adopt her son from a previous union. That boy was Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, the future Emperor Nero. Having eliminated all rivals to her son's path to power, Agrippina was finally ready to strike. According to ancient chroniclers, she slipped some poisonous mushrooms into Claudius's dinner, watching in triumph as her hated husband breathed his last. As the 16-year-old Nero ascended to the throne, hopes ran high that the young emperor might usher in a new golden age. Tutored by the great Stoic philosopher Seneca, Nero initially presented himself as an enlightened ruler who put the welfare of the people first. He banned capital punishment, reduced taxes, and gave slaves the right to file complaints against their masters. But like so many Roman emperors before him, Nero soon fell victim to the corrupting influence of absolute power. More interested in pursuing his artistic pretensions than governing, Nero neglected affairs of state as he indulged his passions for music, poetry, and chariot racing. He believed himself to be the greatest artist of his age, a delusion fed by the sycophants and courtiers who always surrounded him. According to the gossipy biographer Suetonius, Nero even had a nurse executed for laughing during one of his performances. As Nero's behavior grew increasingly erratic, many began to question his fitness to rule. Amid rising discontent, a great fire broke out in Rome in the summer of 64 AD. For 9 days, the conflagration raged, destroying 2/3 of the city as thousands were left homeless. Rumors swirled that Nero himself had started the blaze to clear land for his lavish golden palace. Some even claimed that the emperor had merrily fiddled while his capital burned. Whether the story of Nero's fiddling is fact or fiction, there is no doubt that the emperor used the disaster as an opportunity to reshape Rome according to his own whims. He erected a colossal 100-foot statue of himself, the Colossus of Nero, at the entrance to his sprawling palace complex. To pay for his extravagances, he imposed new taxes and seized property from wealthy nobles. As opposition to his rule mounted, Nero lashed out with increasing brutality. He had his first wife killed and his mother Agrippina stabbed to death. When a plot to depose him was uncovered, he ordered the conspirators to commit suicide, including his old tutor Seneca. By the time rebellions began breaking out across the empire in 68 AD, the emperor had lost all support. Declared a public enemy by the Senate, Nero fled Rome and took his own life, ending the Julio-Claudian dynasty that had ruled the empire for nearly a century. In the chaotic aftermath of Nero's death, the Roman Empire was plunged into a devastating civil war known as the Year of the Four Emperors. One after another, rival generals marched on Rome to seize power for themselves, only to be cut down by the next contender. First came Galba, a wizened old senator who lasted just 7 months before being decapitated by his mutinous troops. Next was Otho, a former drinking buddy of Nero's whose reign ended in suicide after he was defeated in battle. Then there was Vitellius, a gluttonous commander whose first act as emperor was to throw a feast so lavish that it featured a legendary dish called the Shield of Minerva, an entree that required livers of pike, brains of pheasant and peacock, flamingo tongues, and lamprey milt. But Vitellius's endless banquets would soon be cut short. As he gorged himself on delicacies, a new challenger was marching on Rome, a grizzled general named Vespasian who had been declared emperor by his legions in the east. As Vespasian's troops closed in, Vitellius made a pathetic last stand, stumbling drunkenly through the streets as he tried to flee disguised as a priest. Dragged from his hiding place in the palace, the bloated emperor begged for his life before being beaten to death and thrown into the Tiber River. With that ignoble end, the terrible Year of the Four Emperors finally drew to a close. The Flavian dynasty had begun. A tough old soldier who had worked his way up from obscurity, Vespasian proved himself to be one of Rome's most competent and level-headed rulers. He stabilized the empire's finances, reformed the army, and launched an ambitious building program that included icons like the Colosseum. But even this steady hand could not completely escape the intrigues that always swirled through the Roman court. According to ancient gossip, Vespasian's much younger wife Domitilla cuckolded him with a famous actor named Paris. When the emperor found out, he had the actor murdered in the street and banished a nobleman who complained about the affair. More credible is the story that Vespasian died after falling ill with severe diarrhea, quipping with his famous dry wit, "Dear me, I think I'm turning into a god." Vespasian would be succeeded by his eldest son Titus, the beloved conqueror of Jerusalem, who reigned for just 2 years before succumbing to a sudden fever. Ancient writers would long lament Titus as one of history's great what-ifs. a wise and benevolent ruler struck down in his prime. His younger brother Domitian, who took the throne in 81 AD, would not be so fondly remembered. Tall, bald and vain, Domitian had a megalomaniacal streak that led him to demand he be referred to as master and god. He kept a special troop of servants, whose sole job was to continuously wipe the sweat from his forehead. Growing increasingly paranoid, he had the palace halls lined with reflective moonstone, so he could always see who was coming up behind him. Domitian particularly loved to torture and kill flies, stabbing them with a needle-sharp stylus and leaving their bodies piled on his desk. According to the biographer Suetonius, he once asked a servant if anyone else was in the palace, to which the servant wryly replied, "Not even a fly." But for all his precautions, Domitian could not escape the vengeance of those he wronged. In 96 AD, he was stabbed to death in his bedroom by a gang of conspirators that included his own wife. The fallen tyrant's body was hastily cremated on a pyre of cheap wood as the Senate passed a motion condemning his memory to oblivion. In his place, they appointed the elderly Senator Nerva to be the new emperor. It was the first time a ruler had been chosen by the Senate rather than the army or hereditary succession. Although he would reign for just 16 months before dying of natural causes, Nerva's ascension marked the beginning of an era later generations would call the Five Good Emperors. These rulers, who led Rome from 96 to 180 AD, would preside over the high watermark of the Roman Empire. Trajan, the daring general who pushed the imperial borders to their greatest extent. Hadrian, the inveterate traveller who personally inspected nearly every province. Antoninus Pius, the serene administrator who governed with a light yet steady hand. And finally, Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king whose stoic meditations remain revered as a timeless work of wisdom. That golden age would come to an abrupt and ignoble end with Marcus Aurelius' son, Commodus. A muscle-bound brute with a passion for gladiatorial combat, Commodus fancied himself the reincarnation of Hercules. He fought hundreds of times in the arena, most often against amputees and wounded soldiers who were armed with nothing but sponges. Like so many mad emperors before him, Commodus lived in constant fear of plots and intrigues. His paranoia was so great that he once burned a hapless servant alive for making his bath too cold. But no amount of bloodshed could protect him forever. On New Year's Eve, 192 AD, the Praetorian prefect Quintus Aemilius Latus hatched a plan to save Rome from the unhinged emperor's increasing depravities. Together with Commodus's favourite concubine, a wrestler named Narcissus was recruited to strangle the emperor in his bath. As Commodus thrashed beneath the water, Narcissus wrapped his powerful forearm around the emperor's neck and squeezed until he felt the life drain out of him. With a final spasm, the emperor, who had styled himself as an invincible demigod, slipped away into ignominious death. The murder of Commodus would usher in another turbulent period of civil war and upheaval. His successor Pertinax, an upright senator in the mould of Nerva, would be butchered by his own guards after just 86 days. What followed was a dizzying parade of short-lived soldier emperors, each one rising from the ranks of the military, only to be cut down by the next ambitious general. There was Septimius Severus, the canny North African commander who seized power after a bloody civil war. Caracalla, the brooding megalomaniac who murdered his own brother. Elagabalus, the decadent teenage priest who held depraved orgies in the palace. Maximinus Thrax, the hulking barbarian warrior who rose from shepherd boy to emperor. These men were the products of an empire that had grown too vast and unwieldy for any one ruler to control. As the frontiers buckled under barbarian invasions and the economy languished, the 3rd century AD saw no less than 20 emperors meet a violent end. The Roman Empire itself nearly collapsed under the weight of so much chaos and instability. Order would only be restored under the reign of Diocletian, a brilliant general who took drastic steps to stabilize the empire when he came to power in 284 AD. Diocletian divided the empire into eastern and western halves, each one governed by its own co-emperor. This system, known as the Tetrarchy, helped to distribute the burdens of ruling such a vast domain. Diocletian also worked to separate the imperial office from the person of the emperor, establishing a formal court ceremony and bureaucracy that would endure long after he was gone. But there was one young man who refused to be bound by Diocletian's new order. His name was Constantine, and he dreamed of ruling the Roman Empire alone. The son of one of Diocletian's co-emperors, Constantine made his bid for power after his father's death in 306 AD. In a series of brilliant military campaigns, he systematically eliminated his rivals one by one until he stood alone as the sole ruler of Rome. Constantine's reign would mark a turning point in Roman history. In 313 AD, he issued the Edict of Milan, which granted official toleration to Christianity after centuries of persecution. He would go on to embrace the faith himself, becoming the first Christian emperor and forever changing the course of Western civilization. Constantine also founded a new capital city in the east, a glittering metropolis on the Bosporus that would bear his name, Constantinople. As we look back on the long line of emperors who ruled the Roman Empire, we can't help but be struck by the recurring themes of their turbulent lives. The unimaginable power they wielded, and the constant danger they faced from those who would take it away. The shocking acts of cruelty and debauchery they inflicted on their subjects, and the violent ends so many of them met. It's a legacy that continues to captivate us thousands of years later, inviting us to ponder the dark side of human nature that lies within us all. And yet, for all their flaws and excesses, it would be a mistake to dismiss the Roman emperors as mere monsters or tyrants. Among their ranks were also brilliant leaders who expanded the boundaries of human knowledge and achievement. Master builders like Hadrian, fearless conquerors like Trajan, profound thinkers like Marcus Aurelius. Through their triumphs and tragedies, they left an indelible mark on the world that endures to this day. As the moon rises high over the ruined grandeur of the Roman Forum, we can almost imagine their ghosts still walking among the crumbling columns and marble statues, whispering to us from across the ages, daring us to unravel the mysteries that will forever swirl around the lives of the extraordinary men who once held the fate of civilization in their hands. The emperors who ruled the Roman world for an astonishing 500 years, and whose deeds will be remembered for all time. The sprawling expanse of the Roman Empire was a patchwork of peoples and places, knitted together by roads and ruled by one man, the emperor. These men held the fate of millions in their hands, shaping the course of history with their whims and vices. Some, like Titus, are remembered for their generosity and public works. But for every benevolent ruler, there were those whose names live on in infamy. Take Domitian, the younger son of Vespasian. While his father and brother were known for their military prowess and building projects, Domitian's reign was characterized by cruelty, paranoia, and megalomania. It is said he would spend hours alone, brooding and catching flies only to stab them with a needle. He insisted on being addressed as master and god. Any hint of disloyalty, real or imagined, could spell a death sentence. Senators in particular had reason to fear Domitian's mercurial temper. He revived the practice of treason trials, using them to purge his enemies and confiscate their wealth. Even at his own dinner parties, the emperor could not resist reminding his guests of his power over life and death. According to the historian Suetonius, Domitian once invited a group of terrified senators to a banquet where everything, the decor, the servants, the food, was black, evoking a funeral feast. At each place, setting was a gravestone with the guest's name. After a night of mortal dread, they were relieved to be sent home alive, only to find that the tombstones were made of silver, which Domitian gifted to them as a twisted party favour. But Domitian's reign of terror could not last forever. In 96 AD, after a 15-year reign, he was assassinated in a palace conspiracy, stabbed by a servant as he reached for a knife concealed under his pillow, in a chamber where the walls were lined with reflective moonstone, so no one could sneak up on him. It was a fitting end for a tyrant plagued by mistrust. And so, the cycle continued, a parade of larger-than-life figures, leaving their mark on an empire that spanned continents and centuries. After Domitian came a series of rulers known to history as the Five Good Emperors: Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. Chosen by merit rather than birth, they presided over an era of relative peace and prosperity from 96 AD to 180 AD. Nerva's reign was brief but crucial. Appointed by the Senate after Domitian's assassination, this elderly statesman worked to undo the abuses of his predecessor and restore a spirit of cooperation between the emperor and the senatorial class. To ensure a peaceful succession, Nerva adopted the respected general Trajan as his heir. When Nerva died after just 16 months in power, Trajan ascended to the purple with widespread support. Trajan is remembered as a soldier emperor who expanded the empire to its greatest territorial extent. His conquests brought vast riches back to Rome, funding an ambitious building program that reshaped the city. Trajan's Column, a triumphal monument decorated with scenes from his military campaigns, still stands today, a testament to his glory and the Roman genius for engineering. But Trajan was more than a conqueror. He was known for his fairness, his respect for the Senate, and his generosity to the poor. Under his rule, Rome flourished both militarily and culturally. Trajan's legacy was one of prosperity and stability, a golden age for the empire. When Trajan died in 117 AD, his adopted son and chosen successor Hadrian took the throne. Hadrian too was a military man, but his interests ranged far beyond the battlefield. He was a poet, a philosopher, an architect, and a world traveler. Over the course of his 21-year reign, Hadrian spent more than half his time outside Italy, visiting almost every province of the empire. Unlike the conquering Trajan, Hadrian focused on consolidating and defending Rome's vast territory. In Britannia, he built a great wall spanning the width of the island to keep out the barbarian tribes of the north. In Judea, he brutally suppressed a Jewish revolt, expelling the survivors from Jerusalem and rebuilding the city as a Roman colony. But Hadrian is perhaps best remembered for his building projects. A gifted architect, he designed temples, bathhouses, and his own sprawling villa complex outside Rome. His most iconic creation was the Pantheon, a massive domed temple that still stands as a marvel of Roman engineering, its oculus open to the heavens. Like his predecessor Trajan, Hadrian chose his own successor, Antoninus Pius, a senator known for his integrity and even temper. Antoninus ruled peacefully for 23 years, avoiding military conflicts and focusing on good governance. He was a builder like Hadrian, but also a legislator, passing laws to protect slaves, women, and minors. Under Antoninus, the empire enjoyed a period of tranquility and prosperity. Agriculture flourished, trade routes were secure, and the provinces were well administered. The imperial historian Cassius Dio wrote, "The reign of Antoninus is famous for the serenity that enveloped the world, with not a single war begun or carried out." It was said that Antoninus was more interested in preserving Rome than expanding it, a philosophy his successors would come to regret. When Antoninus died in 161 AD, power passed to his adopted son Marcus Aurelius, the last of the 5 good emperors. Marcus was a very different kind of ruler, a philosopher king who struggled to balance his duty to the empire with his stoic ideals of virtue and self-discipline. Raised in the luxurious imperial court, Marcus strove to live modestly, avoiding excess and devoting himself to study. In his private writings, later published as the Meditations, he grappled with timeless questions of morality and mortality. "You could leave life right now," he reminded himself. "Let that determine what you do and say and think." But for all his wisdom, Marcus could not escape the demands of empire. His reign was marked by almost constant warfare as Rome's enemies pressed in on the frontiers. In the east, Marcus fought a long campaign against the Parthian Empire. In the north, he spent years battling Germanic tribes along the Danube, a grueling conflict that took its toll on both the army and the imperial treasury. A deadly pandemic, now thought to have been smallpox, swept through the empire during Marcus's later years, decimating the population and disrupting daily life. Through it all, the emperor persevered, modeling stoic endurance in the face of adversity. When Marcus died in 180 AD, he left behind an empire beset by challenges but still standing, a testament to his strength of character. With the death of Marcus Aurelius, the golden age of the 5 good emperors came to an end. Power passed to his son Commodus, a vain and volatile young man, more interested in the arena than the affairs of state. Commodus fancied himself a gladiator, fighting and inevitably winning hundreds of matches before adoring crowds. Behind the scenes, Commodus was a cruel and capricious ruler. He executed senators on a whim, roamed the imperial palace at night to hunt servants for sport, and even renamed Rome after himself, Colonia Commodiana. His megalomania knew no bounds. Commodus declared himself a god, dressing up as Hercules and demanding to be worshipped. In the end, Commodus fell victim to a palace conspiracy, strangled in his bath by his own wrestling partner. His death in 192 AD marked the end of the Nerva-Antonine dynasty and ushered in a period of chaos known as the Year of the 5 Emperors. In quick succession, 4 men, Pertinax, Didius Julianus, Pescennius Niger, and Clodius Albinus, laid claim to the imperial throne, plunging the empire into civil war. Out of this bloody struggle emerged Septimius Severus, a ruthless general who seized power and founded a new dynasty. Severus was a military man through and through, spending much of his reign on campaign in defense of the empire. He fought successful wars against the Parthians in the east and the troublesome tribes of Britain, expanding Roman territory and securing the frontiers. But Severus was more than just a conqueror. He was a canny politician who worked to centralize power in the imperial court. Severus filled key positions with loyal supporters, many of them fellow Africans, and sidelined the traditional aristocracy. He also courted the favor of the army, raising military pay and granting other privileges to ensure their loyalty. This emphasis on military might would come to define the Severan dynasty and foreshadow the troubles to come. When Severus died in 211 AD, while on campaign in Britain, he left the empire to his sons Caracalla and Geta with the famous advice: "Be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and scorn all other men." It was advice the brothers would not heed. Caracalla and Geta, who had long hated each other, agreed to split the empire between them. But their truce was short-lived. Just a year after their father's death, Caracalla had Geta murdered in their mother's arms and launched a bloody purge of his brother's supporters. As sole emperor, Caracalla proved to be a cruel and capricious ruler in the mold of Caligula or Nero. He was notorious for his arbitrary executions, his sexual excesses, and his strange obsessions. Caracalla was fixated on Alexander the Great, styling himself as a New World conqueror, but his military campaigns were largely unsuccessful, draining the imperial treasury. To fund his extravagances, Caracalla raised taxes and debased the currency. He also extended Roman citizenship to all freemen in the empire, a move that had more to do with expanding the tax base than any sense of egalitarianism. In the end, Caracalla's excesses caught up with him. In 217 AD, he was assassinated by a soldier while relieving himself at the side of the road, an ignominious end for a grandiose emperor. And so the cycle continued, a parade of larger-than-life figures leaving their mark on an empire that spanned continents and centuries. Some, like Elagabalus, are remembered for their shocking excesses. The teenage priest emperor who scandalized Rome with his exotic Eastern rites and sexual proclivities. Others, like Diocletian, are known for their reforms, dividing the empire and establishing the tetrarchy in a bid to stabilize a teetering colossus. And still others, like Constantine, changed the course of history, adopting Christianity and founding a new capital in the East. Through it all, the themes of power, ambition, and mortality loom large. The lives of the Roman emperors are a reminder of the fleeting nature of glory, the corrupting influence of absolute power, and the enduring fascination we have with those who shaped the ancient world. Their stories continue to captivate us, centuries after the fall of the empire they ruled. We now turn our gaze to one of the most extraordinary eras in the history of the Roman Empire, the reign of Commodus and the Severan dynasty. It was a time of larger-than-life characters, breathtaking extravagance, and shocking brutality. The imperial palace became a hothouse of intrigue, where power was violently seized and jealously guarded. Emperors indulged their whims and vices to the fullest, leaving ordinary Romans to marvel at their antics. Our story begins with Commodus, the son and heir of the revered philosopher king Marcus Aurelius. Commodus had been raised in privilege and luxury, and his ascension to the throne at the age of 18 seemed to promise a bright future for Rome. But alas, it was not to be. For Commodus had a fatal fascination with the savage world of gladiatorial combat. He fancied himself a god in human form, the reincarnation of the mythical hero Hercules. The young emperor spent endless hours training with weapons and competing in the arena, much to the horror of the Senate and the bemusement of the people. He fought under the name Hercules Reborn, slaughtering exotic beasts and hapless criminals with reckless abandon. The spectacle was both entrancing and appalling. Some whispered that the emperor had gone mad, but there was a method to his madness. By portraying himself as a divine being, Commodus sought to elevate his status above the petty politicking of the Senate. He demanded to be worshipped as a living god, and those who refused faced dire consequences. The Senate, cowed into submission, could only watch as Commodus indulged his every twisted fantasy. The excesses of Commodus knew no bounds. He hosted lavish banquets where guests dined on exotic delicacies like ostrich brains and flamingo tongues. He filled his private chambers with gold and silver statues of himself in heroic poses. He even renamed Rome after himself, declaring it the colony of Commodus. The treasury was drained dry to pay for his extravagances, and the empire teetered on the brink of bankruptcy. But perhaps most disturbing of all were the depths of Commodus's cruelty. He took great pleasure in personally executing criminals in brutal and imaginative ways. He once had a hapless citizen thrown into the arena to be devoured by wild beasts for the crime of yawning during one of his speeches. He ordered the torture and execution of anyone he perceived as a threat, including members of his own family. The reign of terror could not last forever. In the year 192 AD, after more than a decade of misrule, Commodus was finally brought down by a conspiracy within his own inner circle. His mistress Marcia, fearing for her own life, slipped poison into his wine. When that failed to kill him, an athlete named Narcissus was sent to strangle the emperor in his bath. The Senate rejoiced at the news of Commodus's death, declaring him a public enemy and ordering his statues torn down. But their relief was short-lived. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's personal bodyguards, had grown accustomed to the largesse of Commodus and resented the Senate's attempts to reassert control. They put the throne up for auction, selling it to the highest bidder. The winner was a wealthy senator named Didius Julianus, who promised to pay each soldier a hefty bonus in exchange for their support. But his reign was doomed from the start. The people of Rome, disgusted by the shameless display of corruption, rose up in revolt. Rival generals in the provinces declared themselves emperors and marched on the capital, plunging the empire into civil war. In the end, it was Septimius Severus, a shrewd and ruthless commander from the Balkans, who emerged victorious. He executed Didius Julianus and purged the Senate of his opponents, filling the ranks with his own loyal supporters. He also lavished attention on the army, raising their pay and granting them generous donatives, ensuring their unwavering loyalty. Under Septimius Severus, the empire enjoyed a period of relative stability and prosperity. He embarked on ambitious building projects, including the magnificent Arch of Septimius Severus in the heart of Rome. He expanded the borders of the empire, conquering Mesopotamia from the Parthians and securing the frontiers in Britain and Africa. But even as he brought glory to Rome, Septimius Severus was sowing the seeds of future discord. He elevated the power and prestige of the military to new heights, setting a dangerous precedent for the emperors who would follow. He also faced challenges much closer to home, in the form of his two sons, Caracalla and Geta. The brothers were bitter rivals from a young age, fueled by jealousy and hatred. Their father had unwisely decided to make them joint heirs to the throne, setting the stage for a vicious power struggle. Caracalla, the elder son, was a cruel and unpredictable tyrant in the mold of Commodus. Geta, the younger, was more level-headed but equally ambitious. When Septimius Severus died in 211 AD, the brothers briefly ruled together as co-emperors. But it was an uneasy truce, marred by constant bickering and threats of violence. They divided the imperial palace into separate fortified compounds and rarely appeared in public together for fear of assassination attempts. The tense standoff finally erupted into bloodshed during a meeting brokered by their mother, Julia Domna. Caracalla's henchmen burst into the room and cut down Geta in cold blood as he clung desperately to his mother's robes. Caracalla emerged as the sole ruler of the Roman Empire, his hands stained with his own brother's blood. To secure his grip on power, Caracalla launched a reign of terror that eclipsed even the worst excesses of Commodus. He executed thousands of Geta's supporters, including many prominent senators and generals. He even had his own wife killed for daring to mourn the death of his brother. The emperor's paranoia knew no bounds. Like Commodus before him, Caracalla sought to bolster his legitimacy through grandiose displays of power and divinity. He styled himself as the new Alexander the Great, conquering the East in a series of bloody campaigns. He also expanded Roman citizenship to all free men in the empire, a move that diluted the privileges of the elite and swelled the ranks of taxpayers. But for all his posturing, Caracalla was a deeply troubled man. He was plagued by nightmares and visions of his murdered brother, and he became increasingly erratic and unpredictable. In 217 AD, while traveling in the East, he was assassinated by a disgruntled soldier during a roadside bathroom break. The empire breathed a collective sigh of relief. The death of Caracalla ushered in a period of chaos and instability known as the Crisis of the 3rd Century. Over the next 50 years, more than 20 emperors would rise and fall in quick succession, most meeting violent ends at the hands of their own soldiers. The empire was beset by foreign invasions, economic collapse, and social upheaval on a scale not seen since the fall of the Republic. Amidst the turmoil, a most unlikely figure briefly seized the imperial throne. His name was Elagabalus, and he was just 14 years old when he was declared emperor by the legions in Syria. The young boy had served as a priest of the sun god in the city of Emesa, and he brought his strange and exotic religious practices with him to Rome. Elagabalus was a true original, a flamboyant and gender-bending figure who delighted in flouting convention. He wore makeup and women's clothing, and he married and divorced several women and men in quick succession. He even took a Vestal virgin as his wife, a shocking act of sacrilege that scandalized Roman society. The teenage emperor's sexual appetites were the stuff of legend. He was said to have hosted elaborate orgies in the imperial palace, where he would select his partners based on the size of their genitals. He also had a penchant for lavish banquets, where he would serve rare delicacies like camel's heels and flamingo brains. But Elagabalus's most notorious act was his attempt to elevate his Syrian sun god to the head of the Roman pantheon. He built a grand temple on the Palatine Hill and ordered the sacred relics of other gods to be transferred there, including the ancient statue of Cybele and the fire of Vesta. The move outraged the traditional Roman priesthood and alienated the common people. Elagabalus's short reign was marked by scandal, excess, and religious upheaval. He quickly wore out his welcome with the Praetorian Guard, who resented his foreign ways and effeminate behavior. In 222 AD, after just 4 years on the throne, Elagabalus was murdered by his own soldiers, his body dumped in the Tiber River like so much refuse. The story of Elagabalus is a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and the limits of tolerance in Roman society. The empire had endured its share of eccentric and depraved rulers, but even they had paid lip service to the traditional gods and values of Rome. Elagabalus's open embrace of Eastern decadence and sexual fluidity was a bridge too far for the conservative Roman elites. As we reflect on the tumultuous reigns of Commodus, Caracalla, and Elagabalus, it's easy to see them as aberrations, the product of a decadent and declining empire. But in many ways, they were the logical culmination of centuries of absolute power, concentrated in the hands of a single individual. The Roman emperors were gods on earth, accountable to no one but themselves. It's no wonder that some of them succumbed to the intoxicating allure of their own divinity. And yet, even in the darkest days of imperial excess, there were glimmers of hope and resilience. The Roman people endured, as they always had, finding solace in their families, their communities, and their faith. The empire would go on to survive the crisis of the 3rd century and enjoy a period of renewed stability under the strong leadership of emperors like Diocletian and Constantine. But that is a story for another day. For now, we bid farewell to the mad, bad, and dangerous emperors of Rome, secure in the knowledge that their stories will continue to fascinate and appall us for generations to come. Like the empire they ruled, their legacy is complex and enduring, a testament to the heights of human achievement and the depths of human depravity. And so we sleep, with visions of ancient grandeur and decadence dancing in our heads, grateful for the stable and peaceful lives we lead today. As we've seen, the lives of the Roman emperors were filled with enough scandal, violence, and intrigue to put even the most dramatic modern soap operas to shame. But if you thought the antics of Caligula, Nero, and Commodus represented the heights of imperial notoriety, strap in, we're just getting started. After Commodus was assassinated in 192 AD, the empire descended into a chaotic free-for-all known as the Year of the Five Emperors. In the span of just a few short months, a dizzying succession of rulers seized the purple, only to be cut down by the next ambitious general with an army at his back. First up was Pertinax, a respected senator and city prefect. But his attempts at reform didn't sit well with the pampered Praetorian Guard, and after just 86 days, Pertinax was butchered in his palace by a contingent of disgruntled guardsmen. In a scandalous turn of events, the Praetorians then auctioned off the imperial throne to the highest bidder. A wealthy senator named Didius Julianus won the dubious prize for the princely sum of 25,000 sesterces per man. But his reign would prove to be short-lived. Three prominent generals in the provinces, Pescennius Niger in Syria, Clodius Albinus in Britain, and Septimius Severus in Pannonia, all refused to recognize Julianus's authority and launched bids for power. Through a combination of political savvy, military muscle, and plain old luck, Severus emerged victorious. He secured the surrender of Albinus's much larger army and then crushed Niger's forces in a series of bloody battles. Septimius Severus, a native of North Africa, would go on to rule for 18 years and establish a new imperial dynasty. He was a canny operator and proved to be one of the more effective emperors, strengthening the frontiers and improving infrastructure. But like many of his predecessors, Severus struggled to rein in the power of the army. He famously advised his sons to enrich the soldiers and scorn everybody else on his deathbed. This advice would come back to haunt the empire as Severus's sons, Caracalla and Geta, almost immediately plunged into a vicious rivalry after inheriting the throne together in 211. Caracalla, whose official portraits depicted him with a permanent scowl, was not exactly a people person, but he did have a certain fondness for the army, granting Roman citizenship to all free men in the empire so he could tax them to raise soldiers' pay. He also had a megalomaniacal streak, styling himself as a second Alexander the Great, as he led military campaigns against the Germans and Parthians. In a grim irony, Caracalla would meet his end on one of these expeditions when he was stabbed by a disaffected soldier while relieving himself at the side of the road. The next decade would see the usual carousel of short-lived soldier emperors, but things took a truly bizarre turn with the rise of Elagabalus in 218. Just 14 years old when he was declared emperor by the legions in Syria, Elagabalus was the chief priest of a Syrian sun god and was said to engage in all manner of shocking religious rites and sexual practices. If the tales are to be believed, Elagabalus was the ultimate rebellious teen, hosting lavish orgies, marrying a sacred Vestal virgin, and even prostituting himself in the imperial palace. Unsurprisingly, Elagabalus's antics soon wore out their welcome. After just 4 years, the Praetorian Guard had had enough and cut the young emperor down, along with his domineering mother. His body was unceremoniously dumped in the Tiber River. As a final indignity, the Senate passed a decree of damnatio memoriae, attempting to erase Elagabalus from the historical record. The throne then passed to Elagabalus's more straight-laced cousin, Alexander Severus. But after a 13-year reign focused more on diplomacy than military victories, Alexander too fell victim to soldier mutiny, butchered alongside his mother in a camp on the Rhine frontier. The mid-3rd century would come to be known as the crisis of the 3rd century, a period of economic turmoil, barbarian invasions, and an astonishing 26 emperors in the span of just 50 years. With the frontiers under assault from Germanic tribes and the Persian Sassanids, power increasingly fell to military strongmen. Emperors like Maximinus Thrax, Philip the Arab, and Decius spent little time in Rome, focusing their energy on repelling invasions, often at the cost of their lives. Decius died fighting the Goths in 251, and 8 years later, Emperor Valerian was even captured in battle by the Persian king Shapur-Baqi, an unprecedented humiliation. It's little wonder some Romans feared the empire was on the brink of collapse, but just when all seemed lost, an unlikely savior would emerge in the form of Diocletian, a low-born soldier from the Balkans. Coming to power in 284 after the usual round of coups and civil wars, Diocletian enacted a series of sweeping administrative reforms meant to stabilize the empire. Most notably, he divided power between 4 co-emperors in a system known as the Tetrarchy. While not a permanent solution, the Tetrarchy did manage to beat back the worst of the invasions and give the battered empire some breathing room. The last of our emperor biographies belongs to one of Rome's most influential rulers, Constantine the Great. Born in the province of Mysia to a tetrarch father, Constantine spent his early career as a capable general and administrator. But his life took a dramatic turn in 312 when, on the eve of a massive battle against a rival emperor, he reportedly had a vision of a cross in the sky and heard the words, "In this sign, conquer." Taking this as a sign of divine favor, Constantine triumphed in the battle and soon after issued the Edict of Milan, granting Christianity legal status in the empire. Over the following years, Constantine would progressively favor Christianity, building grand churches, convoking the Council of Nicaea to resolve theological disputes, and even delaying his baptism until his deathbed. While the motivations behind Constantine's religious policies are still debated, there's no question of the profound impact his embrace of Christianity would have on the course of Western civilization. Constantine is also remembered for establishing a new imperial capital in the east, Constantinople, the New Rome. Built on the site of the old Greek city of Byzantium, Constantinople would go on to serve as a bulwark of Roman power for over 1,000 years after the fall of the Western Empire. So there you have it, a whirlwind tour through some of the most scandalous, violent, and just plain bizarre episodes in the lives of the Roman emperors. From the homicidal tantrums of Caligula and Commodus to the megalomania of Nero and Caracalla, these men wielded absolute power, and all too often succumbed to their worst impulses. But the empire endured, thanks in no small part to reformers like Diocletian and savvy political operators like Augustus and Constantine. The stories of the emperors are in many ways the story of Rome itself, a vast, complex entity riven by tensions and contradictions, capable of both astonishing cruelty and soaring achievement. For all their flaws, the emperors left an indelible mark on history, one still visible in the art, architecture, and legal traditions that undergird much of the modern world. Perhaps most of all, their lives serve as a cautionary tale about the corrupting nature of power. As the Stoic philosopher Seneca, who had a front-row seat to imperial intrigues as an advisor to Nero, eloquently put it, "All power is bound to be a burden. All preeminence must be an affliction when a man knows himself." Wise words, even for those of us who will never have to worry about being proclaimed a living God. And with those sober reflections, we come to the end of our nighttime journey through the lives and times of the Roman emperors. From Augustus to Constantine, we've witnessed the heights of Roman power and majesty, but also the depths of human depravity, the debauchery, betrayal, and violence that so often lurked behind the imperial purple. As your mind begins to drift off to explore the dreamscapes of the subconscious, perhaps you'll catch a glimpse of the eternal city in all its splendor and squalor. The marble temples and bloody arenas, the golden palaces and smoke-choked back alleys. And if, in your mind's eye, you happen to spy a crowned figure striding through the mist, clad in a purple-trimmed toga and laurel wreath, take a moment to ponder the burdens of absolute power and the all-too-human foibles of even the mightiest rulers. But now the time has come to bid farewell to the emperors and their empire. The Sandman is calling and the velvet embrace of slumber awaits. So let us whisper a soft Av Atke Val to Augustus, Constantine, and all those who reigned between. Hail and farewell, rulers of Rome, and may your storied lives forever echo through history's hall. Good night. The reign of Diocletian marked a significant shift in the structure and governance of the Roman Empire. Recognizing the challenges of ruling such a vast territory alone, Diocletian established a new system of joint rule known as the Tetrarchy, or Rule of Four. Under this arrangement, power would be shared between two senior emperors, the Augusti, and their two junior colleagues, the Caesars. Diocletian took the eastern provinces under his direct control and named his old comrade Maximian as Augustus of the West. Each would have a Caesar to serve as both deputy and successor. It was a tidy system in theory, but personal ambitions would ultimately unravel Diocletian's grand design. For a time, though, the Tetrarchy brought a measure of stability to an empire battered by invasion and internal strife. Diocletian and his colleagues were all military men of humble origins. They had risen through the ranks by their wits and toughness, and they brought that same rough practicality to imperial government. Diocletian in particular was a shrewd and systematic ruler. He reorganized the empire's Byzantine administrative machinery and sought to rein in the unruly Roman currency. Always conscious of appearances, Diocletian cultivated an aura of remote divinity around the imperial office. Those who approached him now had to prostrate themselves in a ritual called adoratio, a custom borrowed from the Persian court. But for all his achievements, Diocletian is perhaps most remembered for his zealous persecution of Christians. Earlier emperors had targeted the sect sporadically, but Diocletian determined to stamp it out once and for all. He ordered churches destroyed, scriptures burned, and clergy arrested. Christians were expelled from public offices, and thousands were put to death, yet still the faith endured. In a final irony, it would be one of Diocletian's own tetrarchic successors who would reverse his policy and forever transform the spiritual landscape of the empire. As the strain of ruling weighed on him, Diocletian made a decision virtually unprecedented in Roman history. He voluntarily abdicated the throne. In 305 AD, in separate ceremonies choreographed by Diocletian himself, he and Maximian formally resigned their powers and passed the mantle of leadership to their Caesars. Constantius and Galerius now became the new Augusti, but their respective sons, Constantine and Maxentius, were passed over for promotion in favor of two other men, Severus and Maximinus Daia. It was a recipe for dynastic intrigue that would simmer to a boil soon after Diocletian's retirement. The Tetrarchy stumbled on as Constantius campaigned in Britain with his son Constantine at his side. When Constantius died at York in 306, his troops immediately acclaimed Constantine as Augustus. This threw the imperial college into disarray. Galerius, the senior Augustus, offered Constantine the lesser rank of Caesar, but Constantine accepted the compromise with the secret intent of securing his claim to greater power. Events now unfolded at a dizzying pace. Maxentius, son of the retired Emperor Maximian, rebelled at Rome and declared himself emperor. His father Maximian soon joined him and reclaimed his own lapsed imperial title. The Western Empire convulsed in civil war as Constantine, Maximian, Maxentius, and Severus maneuvered against each other. Through a mix of statecraft, treachery, and battlefield prowess, Constantine emerged supreme. He accepted the surrender of his rival Maximian, only to drive him to suicide when he later plotted against Constantine. More dramatically, Constantine routed the army of Maxentius at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge and reported a miraculous vision on the eve of combat that changed the course of history. In the sky above, Constantine claimed to have seen a cross of light and the words, "In this sign, conquer." Stirred by this omen, he ordered his soldiers to mark their shields with the Chi Rho, the first two letters of Christ's name in Greek. Constantine triumphed in battle and entered Rome as its liberator, but his victory had profound spiritual implications. Although accounts differ on the details of his conversion, there's no doubt that Constantine embraced Christianity as his guiding faith from this point forward. With his eastern counterpart Licinius, he issued the Edict of Milan in 313, granting religious tolerance and ending the persecution of Christians. It was a revolutionary act that aligned the empire with the once despised sect and set the stage for Christianity's ultimate dominance. Constantine completed his ascent in 324 by defeating Licinius and reuniting the empire under his sole authority. He ushered in a new, overtly Christian order epitomized by his eponymous capital, Constantinople. Here, on the ancient site of Byzantium overlooking the Bosphorus, Constantine erected a new Rome, a city adorned with churches instead of pagan temples. The reign of Constantine the Great marks a turning point as momentous as nearly any in Roman history. The stubborn faith that Diocletian had tried to destroy now enjoyed official imperial favour. The Roman Empire would never be the same. As the city of Constantine flourished in the east, its venerable counterpart Rome entered a long, slow twilight. The empire's centre of gravity had shifted decisively eastward, and the old gods of the Roman pantheon slipped into obsolescence. An emperor would rule again in the west, but not from Rome and not for long. The last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the German warlord Odoacer in 476. So ended the Western Roman Empire, more with a whimper than a bang, after an improbable run of some 500 years from Augustus to Augustulus. The grand story of its rise and fall continues to captivate us and resonate with our own times. The lurid escapades of emperors like Caligula and Nero still shock and titillate. The stoic wisdom of a Marcus Aurelius still inspires. The world-altering edicts of Constantine still reverberate through history. In these outsized characters, we see qualities both admirable and abhorrent, often in the same person. What is it about these long-dead rulers that still commands our attention and sparks our imagination? Perhaps it's a morbid fascination with the human capacity for both monumental achievement and staggering depravity. The emperors, after all, were flesh and blood men, however powerful, grappling with many of the same fundamental questions we face. What constitutes a life well lived? A society well governed? A legacy worth leaving? In the end, what the emperors built endured long after they were gone. The empire that was the stage for their triumphs and excesses became something greater than any one of them. Its laws, languages, and arts shaped the world immeasurably for generations. For better and worse, we still live in the shadow of Rome. So when we gaze back across the centuries at the lives of the Caesars, we are in a sense looking into a distant mirror, one that reflects humanity in all its complex splendor and squalor. The march of years may muffle their names, but never fully silence their stories. They are a part of us, and we of them. As long as we feel that tug of connection to the past, the Roman emperors will not sleep alone in death. We will keep them fitfully, thrillingly awake in our thoughts and our dreams, an unquiet part of our historical soul. As we've seen, the reign of Nero marked a tumultuous and transformative time for the Roman Empire. His death in 68 AD plunged Rome into chaos and civil war, ushering in a period of instability known as the Year of the Four Emperors. In the aftermath of Nero's demise, the empire teetered on the brink of collapse. Rival claimants to the throne emerged, each backed by their own legions and political factions. The first to make a play for power was Galba, the governor of Hispania. A grim and elderly disciplinarian, Galba had a reputation for cruelty and miserliness that quickly eroded any initial support. As unrest simmered in the capital, the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's personal bodyguards, shifted their allegiance to Otho, a former companion of Nero. Otho had once been a close friend of Nero, partaking in the excesses and debaucheries of his court. However, he fell from favour after Nero became enamoured with Otho's wife, Poppaea Sabina. Nero sent Otho away to govern the distant province of Lusitania, but Otho never forgot the slight. Seizing his chance amid the turmoil, Otho won over the Praetorians with lavish bribes and promises. In a swift coup, they declared Otho emperor and cut down Galba in the Roman Forum just months into his reign. But Otho's victory celebration was short-lived. Across the empire, the legions were restive, with little loyalty to the disgraced Nero or his cronies. In Germania, the ambitious governor Vitellius had already been hailed as emperor by his troops. Now two rival emperors prepared for war, in a contest that would drench Italy in blood. Vitellius was a seasoned commander, with a gluttonous appetite for both food and power. Corpulent and crude, he advanced on Rome with a formidable army, his soldiers plundering the countryside as they marched. Otho rode out to confront Vitellius, but his smaller force was decisively defeated at the Battle of Bedriacum. Rather than prolong the civil war, Otho fell on his sword, leaving Vitellius to enter Rome unopposed as the third emperor in this chaotic year. Vitellius set about cementing his rule in an orgy of excess and violence. He hosted lavish banquets, gorging himself on rare delicacies, while his praetorians rampaged through the city. Officials and aristocrats who had backed his rivals were summarily executed. The capricious cruelty and gluttony of the Vitellian reign became legendary. The disgusted citizens soon dubbed him the glutton and hated their new emperor. Meanwhile, in the eastern provinces, a new contender was gathering strength. Titus Flavius Vespasianus, or Vespasian, was a grizzled general fresh from suppressing the Jewish revolt in Judea. Respected by his troops and positioned close to the strategically vital grain supply of Egypt, Vespasian was a formidable challenger. As word of Vitellius's disgusting excesses spread, Vespasian's legions clamored for him to claim the throne. Leaving his son Titus to finish the war in Judea, Vespasian marched west towards Italy, where his troops clashed with the Vitellian forces in a second battle of Bedriacum. This time, the Flavian side emerged victorious, scattering the Vitellian army and opening the way to Rome. As a last spasm of civil war engulfed the capital, a terrified Vitellius tried to abdicate and slink away, but enraged soldiers and civilians dragged the disgraced emperor through the streets, torturing and humiliating him before finally hacking him to pieces. And so the year of the four emperors drew to a close, with Vespasian marching through the blood-stained streets of Rome to claim his prize. The Flavian dynasty that would rule for 27 years had begun, but memories of the anarchy would linger. The empire had barely survived this bitter struggle for supremacy, riven by ambition, betrayal, and bloodshed. Though the Pax Romana would largely return under Vespasian and his sons, the scars of civil war would shape Roman politics for generations to come. Vespasian proved to be a competent and stabilizing emperor, whose common sense and steady leadership were welcome antidotes to the madness of Nero and the chaos of the interregnum. Born to an obscure family, Vespasian had risen through the ranks of the army on his merits as a canny and courageous commander. Now he brought his practicality to bear on an empire ravaged by turmoil. One of Vespasian's first priorities was to restore the state's depleted finances. The extravagances of Nero, the disruptions of civil war, and a crippling economic downturn had pushed Rome to the brink of bankruptcy. Vespasian instituted new taxes, including the notorious tax on urine collected from public toilets for use in leather tanning. When his son Titus complained about the disgusting nature of the tax, Vespasian famously held up a coin and quipped, "Pecunia non olet," money does not stink. Such down-to-earth humor was typical of Vespasian. He largely eschewed the pomp and luxury that his predecessors had wallowed in. While he did build a massive amphitheatre, the Flavian Amphitheatre, or Colosseum, he did so partly to boost employment and win popular support. Unlike the egomaniacs who came before, Vespasian seems to have understood the importance of bread and circuses in pacifying the restive Roman mob. Vespasian also sought to restore traditional Roman values and religious practices that had languished under the impious or indifferent rule of past emperors. He revived the ancient priesthoods and rebuilt the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, which had been destroyed in the civil strife. As a conservative Italian, Vespasian placed great importance on propriety and piety as cornerstones of a stable society. Not that Vespasian was above some of the brutal power politics that came with the purple robes of Imperium. He dealt ruthlessly with any hint of opposition from the Senate or disloyal legions. According to the gossipy biographer Suetonius, Vespasian even wept at the execution of 2 alleged conspirators, all while continuing to tuck into his dinner. Still, compared to most emperors, Vespasian comes down to us as a reasonably just and clear-eyed ruler who began the process of putting a battered empire back together again. When he fell ill in 79 AD, Vespasian joked that he was becoming a god, mocking the usual deification of dead emperors. Then, struggling to his feet, he gasped, "An emperor should die standing," and breathed his last. The empire would never be entirely secure or at peace, but under the steady hand of Vespasian, it had found a welcome respite from the follies and depravities of Julio-Claudian rule. The stage was set for his eldest son Titus to inherit the throne and continue the Flavian dynasty's efforts to stabilize and strengthen a Roman world, still reeling from the anarchy of the recent past. Though further calamities and madmen would periodically shake the foundations of imperial power, the solid, soldierly virtues of Vespasian had steadied the ship of state and ushered in a new era of comparative calm and prosperity for the far-flung Roman Empire. As we've seen, the early Roman emperors, from Augustus to Nero, set a precedent for both the grandeur and the depravity that would characterize the rulers of the world's greatest empire. But if anyone thought the madness might end with the passing of the Julio-Claudians, they were sorely mistaken. What followed was an age of such chaos and upheaval that it's a wonder Rome survived at all. The year was 69 AD, and in the aftermath of Nero's shocking suicide, the empire found itself rudderless, drifting in a sea of uncertainty. In the span of just a few short months, no less than 4 men would claim the throne, each rising to power on a wave of violence and treachery, only to be cut down just as quickly by the next usurper in line. First came Galba, a grizzled old general who marched on Rome with his legions, determined to restore order and discipline to an empire that had grown soft and decadent under Nero's misrule. But Galba was not the savior Rome hoped for. Dour, stingy, and utterly lacking in charisma, he quickly alienated the Senate, the people, and worst of all, his own soldiers, who had expected rich rewards for their loyalty. Barely 6 months after taking power, Galba was brutally cut down by his own Praetorian Guard, who had thrown their support behind a rival claimant named Otho. A dashing nobleman with a taste for the finer things in life, Otho had once been a boon companion of Nero himself, sharing in the emperor's debauched revels, and even, so the rumors said, his bed. But when Nero's star began to fall, the cunning Otho saw his chance to seize power for himself. For a brief moment, it seemed that Otho's gamble had paid off. Hailed as emperor by the Praetorians, he rode into Rome in triumph, promising the people a return to the good old days of bread and circuses. But Otho's reign was to be even shorter than Galba's, for out in the provinces, another contender for the throne was gathering his forces. Aulus Vitellius was a man cut from the same cloth as Otho, a creature of the court, more at home in the banquet hall than on the battlefield. But what he lacked in martial prowess, he made up for in sheer, brazen ambition. With the backing of the legions in Germany, Vitellius marched on Rome, his army swelling with each passing mile as soldiers and provincials alike rallied to his banner. When the two armies met at the Battle of Bedriacum, it was a slaughter. Vitellius's forces, hardened by years of fighting on the empire's frontiers, made short work of Otho's Praetorian Guard, who broke and ran in the face of the enemy's fury. Otho himself, seeing all was lost, fell on his sword, leaving Vitellius the last man standing in the bloody scramble for the throne. But if Vitellius thought his troubles were over, he was sadly mistaken. For even as he celebrated his victory with a lavish feast, word reached Rome of yet another challenger arising in the east. Titus Flavius Vespasianus, or Vespasian as he was known, was everything Vitellius was not: a battle-hardened general, a shrewd politician, and a man of unimpeachable integrity. With the legions of Syria and Judea at his back, Vespasian began his own march on the capital, determined to put an end to the chaos and restore stability to the empire. What followed was a year of brutal civil war, as Vespasian and Vitellius fought for control of Rome itself. Vitellius, his nerve failing as his hold on power slipped away, barricaded himself in the imperial palace while his armies sacked and burned their way across Italy. But in the end, there could be only one victor. In December of 69 AD, Vespasian's troops breached the walls of Rome, storming the palace and dragging the cowering Vitellius out into the street, where he was beaten and strangled before his body was hurled into the Tiber. And so began the reign of Vespasian, the first in a new dynasty that would breathe fresh life into the stagnant empire. A man of humble origins who had risen through the ranks of the army by sheer grit and determination, Vespasian brought a much-needed dose of common sense and stability to the imperial throne. He slashed taxes, cracked down on corruption, and launched an ambitious program of public works, including the construction of the mighty Colosseum, which still stands today as a testament to his legacy. But perhaps Vespasian's greatest achievement was the restoration of the empire's finances, which had been drained by years of civil war and reckless spending. Ever the pragmatist, Vespasian was not above a bit of creative accounting to refill the imperial coffers. When his son Titus complained of the unpleasant odour emanating from the public latrines, Vespasian is said to have held up a coin and quipped, "Pecunia non olet." Money doesn't stink. It was a fitting motto for a man who, in his 10 years on the throne, did more to stabilize and strengthen the empire than any ruler since Augustus himself. When Vespasian died in 79 AD, he was able to pass on a secure and prosperous realm to his eldest son Titus, who would prove to be a worthy successor in his own right. But as so often happened in the annals of Roman history, triumph was followed by tragedy. Titus, the conquering hero of the Jewish War, ruled for barely 2 years before he was struck down by a mysterious illness, leaving the throne to his younger brother Domitian. And with Domitian's ascension, the darkness that had lurked at the heart of the empire for so long began to creep back in, like a cancer that could never be fully excised. Domitian was a man consumed by suspicion and paranoia, seeing enemies and conspiracies lurking around every corner. He ruled with an iron fist, ruthlessly purging the Senate of anyone he perceived as a threat, and executing scores of real and imagined traitors. Even his own family was not safe from his wrath. When he suspected his wife of carrying on an affair, Domitian had her exiled and her alleged lover executed in the middle of the street. But for all his brutality, Domitian was not without his virtues. A skilled administrator and a patron of the arts, he oversaw a period of relative peace and prosperity, expanding the empire's borders and launching a massive building program that rivaled even that of his father. The palace he built on the Palatine Hill, with its soaring domes and glittering mosaics, was a wonder of the ancient world, a testament to the grandeur and magnificence of Rome at the height of its power. Yet even as he basked in the glory of his own achievements, Domitian could not escape the growing tide of discontent that was rising up against him. His cruelty and megalomania had earned him the hatred of the senatorial class, who saw in him a tyrant in the mold of Nero or Caligula. And when a group of disgruntled courtiers finally hatched a plot to assassinate him in 96 AD, there were few who mourned his passing. And so the Flavian dynasty came to an end, cut down in its prime by the very forces of chaos and violence that it had sought to tame. But the legacy of Vespasian and his sons would endure long after their deaths, setting the stage for a new era of prosperity and stability that would come to be known as the Golden Age of the Roman Empire. As the sun rose over the 7 hills of Rome on the morning of September 19th, 96 AD, the city was abuzz with rumors and speculation. The news of Domitian's assassination had spread like wildfire, and everywhere people gathered in hushed whispers to discuss what it might mean for the future of the empire. In the Senate House, the mood was one of cautious optimism. For years, the senators had chafed under Domitian's tyrannical rule, watching helplessly as he stripped them of their power and dignity. Now, with the emperor dead and no clear successor in sight, they saw a chance to reassert their authority and steer the ship of state back onto a course of their own choosing. But even as they debated and plotted, a new contender for the throne was already making his move. Marcus Cocceius Nerva was an elderly senator of impeccable breeding and unimpeachable integrity, a man who had survived the reigns of some of Rome's most notorious emperors by keeping his head down and his nose clean. Now, with the backing of his fellow senators and the support of the Praetorian Guard, Nerva stepped forward to claim the imperial purple. It was a bold move, and not without risk. Nerva was old and frail, and many doubted whether he had the strength or the will to hold the empire together in such turbulent times. But the new emperor proved to be more than up to the task. In his brief reign of just 16 months, Nerva worked tirelessly to undo the damage wrought by Domitian's misrule, repealing oppressive laws, recalling exiled dissidents, and restoring the traditional rights and privileges of the Senate. But Nerva's greatest achievement was perhaps his most far-sighted. Recognizing that he was not long for this world, the childless emperor took the unprecedented step of adopting an heir, not from among his own family or inner circle, but from the ranks of the empire's most distinguished generals. The man he chose was Marcus Ulpius Trajanus, better known to history as Trajan. It was a masterstroke of political maneuvering. By naming Trajan as his successor, Nerva ensured a smooth and peaceful transition of power, while also sending a clear message to the legions that their interests would be well served under the new regime. And when Nerva died in January of 98 AD, Trajan was ready to take up the mantle of leadership, ushering in a new era of conquest and glory for the Roman Empire. From the moment he took the throne, Trajan proved himself to be a ruler of unparalleled energy and ambition. A military man to the core, he wasted no time in launching a series of campaigns that would expand the empire's borders to their greatest extent in history. In the north, he subdued the troublesome Dacian tribes, annexing their territory and turning it into a new Roman province. In the east, he marched his legions all the way to the Persian Gulf, smashing the armies of the mighty Parthian Empire and claiming the ancient cities of Babylon and Ctesiphon for Rome. But Trajan was more than just a conqueror. He was also a builder and a visionary, a man who understood that the strength of an empire lay not just in its armies, but in the prosperity and well-being of its people. Everywhere he went, Trajan left a trail of grand public works in his wake, aqueducts and bridges, temples and theatres, all bearing the unmistakable stamp of Roman genius and ingenuity. Back in Rome, the emperor poured his newfound wealth into a massive program of urban renewal, constructing a sprawling new forum that bore his name and erecting a towering column to commemorate his victories. The markets and granaries he built ensured a steady supply of food for the city's teeming masses, while his baths and gymnasiums provided a much-needed respite from the cares of daily life. Under Trajan's steady hand, The empire enjoyed a rare period of peace and prosperity, a golden age in which art and literature flourished, and the bounds of human knowledge were pushed to their very limits. It was a time when anything seemed possible, when the dream of a world united under the banner of Rome seemed closer than ever before. But even the greatest of emperors must eventually shuffle off this mortal coil. And in 117 AD, Trajan fell ill while campaigning in the east. As he lay dying in the city of Selinus, he named his cousin and longtime companion Hadrian as his successor, passing on the torch of leadership to a man who would prove to be one of the most remarkable rulers in all of Roman history. Hadrian was a man of many talents and contradictions, a warrior and a scholar, a poet and a philosopher, a builder and a dreamer. He was a restless soul, a man who spent more time traveling the far-flung corners of his empire than he ever did in Rome itself. From Britain to Egypt, from Greece to Judea, Hadrian journeyed tirelessly, leaving his mark on every land he touched. In Britain, he ordered the construction of a great wall to mark the northern edge of Roman territory, a feat of engineering that still stands today as a testament to the empire's reach and ambition. In Athens, he presided over a cultural renaissance, sponsoring the construction of grand new temples and patronizing the greatest minds of his age. And in Judea, he ruthlessly suppressed a Jewish revolt, earning the enmity of a people who would remember him as a cruel and merciless tyrant. But for all his achievements, Hadrian was also a deeply troubled man, haunted by his own demons and struggling to find his place in a world that seemed to be slipping away from him. He was plagued by bouts of melancholy and despair, and in his later years, he became increasingly erratic and unpredictable, lashing out at those closest to him and retreating ever deeper into his own mind. In the end, it was his own hubris that would prove to be Hadrian's undoing. In a fit of pique, he named as his successor a young man named Lucius Aelius, a frivolous and dissolute character who was wholly unsuited to the demands of leadership. When Aelius died just a year later, Hadrian was forced to choose again, this time settling on a respected senator named Antoninus Pius. It was a choice that would prove to be a wise one. Antoninus, a man of quiet dignity and unshakable integrity, would go on to rule the empire for 23 years, presiding over an era of peace and prosperity that would come to be known as the Golden Age of the Antonines. Under his steady hand, Rome continued to flourish, its borders secure, and its people content. But even as the empire basked in the glow of its own achievements, dark clouds were gathering on the horizon. In the east, a new power was rising, a fiercely independent kingdom that would one day challenge Rome for supremacy of the known world. And in the heart of the empire itself, a new breed of ruler was emerging, a philosopher king who would seek to lead his people not through conquest and glory, but through wisdom and virtue. His name was Marcus Aurelius, and his reign would mark the beginning of the end for the Roman Empire, as it had once been known. But that is a story for another time, a tale of decline and fall, of hubris and folly, of a dream that flickered and died in the gathering darkness, of a world that was changing faster than even the mightiest of empires could hope to keep pace. For now, let us linger a while in the golden age of Rome, in the days when the Pax Romana stretched from the mists of Britannia to the sands of Arabia, and the light of reason and civilization shone forth like a beacon in the night. Let us remember the emperors who built that world, the men who tamed the forces of chaos and held the line against the barbarism that lurked at the edges of the known world. From Augustus to Trajan, from Hadrian to Antoninus Pius, these were the men who shaped the destiny of an empire and left their mark on the pages of history. Their stories are the stuff of legend, tales of courage and cowardice, of honor and betrayal, of the heights of human achievement and the depths of human depravity. And as we look back on their lives and deeds, we cannot help but be struck by the enduring fascination they hold for us still. For in their triumphs and their tragedies, their glories and their follies, we see reflected the hopes and fears, the dreams and nightmares of our own age, of a world that is ever-changing, and yet somehow always the same. So let us raise a glass to the emperors of Rome, to the men who dared to dream of a world without limits, and who built an empire that would endure for 1,000 years and more. Theirs was a legacy that would echo through the ages, a testament to the indomitable spirit of a people who once dared to reach for the very stars themselves. And though the empire they built may have crumbled into dust, though the glories of Rome may have faded into the mists of time, their memory lives on in the hearts and minds of all those who have ever been touched by the magic and the majesty of the eternal city. For as long as men and women dream of greatness, as long as the human spirit yearns for the infinite and the unknown, the story of Rome will never die, and the emperors who ruled her will never be forgotten. Sadly, the fate of Valerian would foreshadow the disastrous times to come for the Roman Empire in the 3rd century. The era of the soldier emperors saw the rapid rise and fall of military strongmen, with a dizzying 20 emperors in just 49 years, from 235 to 284 AD. The very foundations of the empire were shaken by internal power struggles, barbarian invasions, economic turmoil and plague. The first of these so-called barracks emperors was Maximinus Thrax, a low-born brute who seized power after the murder of the young Severus Alexander. A Thracian of barbarian stock and a man of colossal size and strength, Maximinus rose through the ranks of the army by his sheer martial prowess. As emperor, he ruled with the mindset of a common soldier, disdaining the trappings of royal dignity. He waged punishing campaigns against the Germanic tribes, but his harsh methods and failure to pay the troops led to an officer's revolt. Maximinus was slain outside the walls of Aquileia in 238, and his severed head was paraded through Rome on a pole. The aged Gordian III, a descendant of the famous Gracchi brothers, briefly took the purple alongside his son Gordian II. But their reign lasted a mere 20 days before they were defeated and killed by forces loyal to Maximinus. Next came Pupienus and Balbinus, a pair of senators hastily appointed by the terrified Senate. They too fell to the swords of their own Praetorian guards after just 99 days, in favour of the 13-year-old Gordian III. This child emperor's 6-year reign was dominated by his advisors, chiefly the crafty Praetorian prefect Time Scythius, whose daughter Tranquillina was wed to the young ruler in a bid to control him. Gordian III campaigned against the Persians with some success, but died under mysterious circumstances in 244, likely at the instigation of Philip the Arab, Time Scythius's successor as Praetorian prefect. Philip, who now styled himself as emperor, presided over the 1000th anniversary of the founding of Rome in 248 AD with magnificent festivities and games, even as the empire crumbled around him. His attempt to buy peace from the Goths proved disastrous, as other barbarian tribes soon demanded similar tributes. Rebellions flared up in the provinces, including one led by Pacatianus in Moesia and Jotapianus in Syria. The most serious challenge came from Decius, a senator and experienced general sent to quell the mutiny in Moesia. Instead, Decius's troops proclaimed him emperor and marched on Italy. Philip was slain in battle near Verona in 249 AD, leaving Decius as the new master of the Roman world. Decius, though he reigned only 2 years, is remembered for his empire-wide persecution of Christians, whom he blamed for angering the gods and bringing misfortune on Rome. Many prominent Christians were martyred during his reign, including Pope Fabian. Decius himself met an ignominious end, falling in battle against the invading Goths at the disaster of Abritus in 251. In the chaotic years that followed, the frontiers collapsed under the onslaught of Goths, Alemanni, Franks, and Persians. Plague swept through the empire, while the economy spiraled into hyperinflation. The Emperor Valerian, who had once been a respected senator and able general, was humiliated and captured in battle by the Persian king Shapur III. According to some accounts, Valerian was used as a human footstool by Shapur before being executed, and his skin dyed red and displayed as a trophy. Valerian's son Gallienus, left as sole emperor, faced a staggering array of usurpers and breakaway states. The western provinces of Gaul, Britain, and Spain broke away to form the so-called Gallic Empire under the rebel Postumus. In the east, the gifted general Odenathus of Palmyra carved out a power base and was even acknowledged as a quasi-co-emperor for his service in defeating the Persians. After Odenathus's death, his widow Zenobia styled their young son as Augustus and declared de facto independence from Rome. Gallienus, an underrated ruler who strove mightily to hold the empire together, fell victim to yet another military revolt in 268 AD. One of his top generals, Aureolus, raised the standard of rebellion and was besieged at Milan by Gallienus. However, several of Gallienus's officers, including the future emperors Claudius Gothicus and Aurelian, formed a conspiracy and had him assassinated. Claudius II, called Gothicus for his victories over the Goths, ruled ably for 2 years before succumbing to the plague. His successor Aurelian, who rose from humble origins in the Balkans, was a brilliant general who reunited the shattered empire by reconquering the Gallic Empire and defeating Zenobia's Palmyrene state. Aurelian was hailed as restorer of the world for his triumphs, but his strict discipline led to his murder at the hands of disgruntled officers in 275. The late 3rd century saw several strong soldier emperors who began the work of rebuilding the empire. Probus won victories over barbarians on the Rhine and Danube frontiers. Carus reconquered Mesopotamia from the Persians. His son Numerian was a cultured man of letters who was said to have been blinded by weeping over the death of his father. The blind, bookish Numerian was soon slain by his father-in-law and Praetorian prefect Aper, leading to the accession of Diocletian in 284 AD. Diocletian, a canny officer of obscure origins from Dalmatia, ushered in a new era with his reforms. To better manage the unwieldy empire, he divided rule between 4 co-emperors in the Tetrarchy system, 2 senior Augusti and 2 junior Caesars. Diocletian's trusted comrade Maximian was appointed as his co-Augustus in the west, while Galerius and Constantius Chlorus served as the Caesars. The Tetrarchs ruthlessly suppressed internal threats. Maximian put down the rebellions of Carausius and Electus in Britain, while Galerius defeated the usurper Domitius Domitianus in Egypt. They secured the frontiers with fortifications and mobile armies, and rejuvenated the economy with tax and currency reforms. However, Diocletian is also notorious for presiding over the Great Persecution, the last and bloodiest official persecution of Christians in the empire. In 305 AD, Diocletian and Maximian jointly abdicated in an unprecedented move, elevating Galerius and Constantius as the new Augusti. The peaceful transition envisioned by Diocletian did not last long. Constantius died the next year in Britain, and his troops proclaimed his son Constantine as emperor. Galerius appointed Severus as Western Augustus, but he was challenged by Maxentius, the son of Maximian, leading to civil war. The ambitious Constantine shrewdly navigated the rivalries between his fellow claimants. He defeated Maxentius at the epical Battle of the Milvian Bridge, where he fought under the sign of the Christian cross after a famed vision. He then forged an alliance with the Eastern Emperor Licinius, sealed by the marriage of his sister. Together they issued the Edict of Milan in 313, granting religious tolerance to Christians and ending the persecutions once and for all. However, the fraternal amity between Constantine and Licinius did not last. The two Augusti eventually fell out and fought a series of civil wars. Constantine, now a committed Christian, triumphed over the pagan Licinius and reunited the empire under his sole rule in 324 AD. To inaugurate his reign as a new kind of Christian emperor, Constantine founded the grand new capital of Constantinople on the site of the old city of Byzantium. Constantine's favor played a crucial role in the growth of Christianity, as he lavished patronage on the church, built grand basilicas like Old Saint, Peter's in Rome, and intervened in ecclesiastical affairs. Most famously, he convened the First Council of Nicaea in 325 to settle doctrinal disputes and formulate the Nicene Creed, still recited by Christians today. By the end of his reign, Christianity had gone from a persecuted minority faith to the most powerful religion in the empire. When Constantine died in 337, he left behind an empire transformed, still beset by threats from without and tensions within, but reinvigorated by a new imperial system and unified under the banner of a new faith. The bloody turmoil of the 3rd century was over, and Rome would endure in various forms for another 1,000 years and more. And so our whirlwind tour through the lives of the Roman emperors draws to a close. The characters we've met along the way, from sly Augustus to tyrannical Nero, from dissolute Commodus to steadfast Marcus Aurelius, from the reformer Diocletian to the holy Constantine, represent the grand spectrum of human virtue and vice, triumph and tragedy. Theirs was a world of dizzying highs and terrifying lows, of orgiastic excess and casual violence, of shocking betrayals and soaring glories. Though separated from us by some 2 millennia, these ancient rulers still captivate us with their outsized personalities and world-altering deeds. Their lives serve as a mirror for the eternal human condition in all its flawed splendor. In studying these distant figures, we catch a glimpse of our own selves, and perhaps a warning from the past for our turbulent present. Well, this brings us to the end of our meandering journey into the annals of Roman imperial history. If you've enjoyed this dreamy dive into the scandalous secrets of the Caesars, be sure to like, subscribe, and drift off to sleep, pondering the nature of power. Until next time, sweet dreams.